So nice to see you. This is year 5 for me. And a lot has changed over the last 5 years. I'm still bitter about the people who said I'd fallen for a Ponzi scheme. Said this is a scam, it was a racket. What's wrong with me? I thought you were a smart guy, right? So they were all telling me this in 2012. So I'm still holding on to those resentments, you know. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. I don't know if you've heard this, but we're now, the government shut down. Did you know that? Yeah, a lot of government shutdowns. He's over there clapping, right? You're clapping about it. How many of you came through the TSA in the airport somewhere here? You notice the lines were a little longer? I mean, in Atlanta, it was like 3 hours, you know, to get through security. The employees are being forced to show up even though they're not getting paid. Imagine doing that to your employees, right? You'd all be arrested. I mean, it would just be a scandal. Government gets away with this stuff every day. I noticed that the TSA employees were a little happier than usual, though, because all the passengers were walking up to them saying things like, "Thanks so much for your service. I appreciate you being here." And they're like, "Wait, I thought we were the most hated people in the country. Why does everybody suddenly like us?" It's kind of awesome. I think this shutdown is extremely significant for American public life, but also for crypto. And the reason is that it underscores something that maybe not everybody was fully aware of, that government these days is the worst possible central point of failure, and it's basically non-functional. That's what we're living through right now, my friends. It's not working anymore. And the shutdown is making the point. You know, I was looking at the data the other day about government popularity since World War II. Do you know that in 1964, 76% of Americans were willing to say that they trusted the government to do the right thing? 76%. Imagine that. Today, it's down to about 15%. That's a dramatic change. That's a huge change in the public philosophy that we use to govern our lives, the things we believe in as a culture. And I'd like to see what these numbers are going to look like if this shutdown continues. I mean, I know some of us in this room are kind of happy about, you know, watching this all happen. It's not so great for some people, though. Like if you're if you're running a microbrewery and you have to get a new authorization for a new beer and a label, under the current system you have to go crawling to the BATF. Is that, yeah, Bureau of Alcohol. Yeah, they stop every sin, right? No alcohol, tobacco, or firearms, right? So you have to go to them and get them to approve it. Well, right now they're shut down, so they're not approving any new beers. So you've made a beer, you're waiting for the approval. There's nothing you can do except just drink it yourself. You know, that's it. It's affecting a lot of industries. Obviously, the airline industry. I wonder if at some point the airlines are just going to say, "Hey, we want to run our own security. We want the freedom to do that." But right now, they don't have that freedom. I tell you, something else that's been profoundly affected are initial public offerings of stock. The SEC is no longer approving them, right? So you think about that and consider the crypto alternative, right? And you ask yourself the question, why is it that so many people think it would be a good idea for crypto to be regulated by the federal government? That's a very bad idea, actually. You talk about a point of failure. It's a disaster waiting to happen, and it can't happen. We represent an alternative to that. So why does all this stuff matter? Well, there's more to it than that. It's not just that the government is non-functioning. Affiliated government institutions like central banks are now under a tremendous disaster, really, in terms of their own functionality. You remember that Bitcoin was originally created as a response, in part, to the financial crisis of 2008. That's when the white paper came out in October. As an alternative to the system that was no longer working for regular people. The entire financial system really fell apart. they tell us they saved it. Well, you know how they saved it, right? How the Fed saved the financial system? The Federal Reserve created a lot of new money and bought all the assets that were collapsing in prices at non-market prices, held them on the books, and then just called the system solvent, essentially. So right now, that's the way they did it. Now, how do you stop that from becoming a hyperinflation? Well, at that point, the Federal Reserve started paying for deposits on banks at the Federal Reserve more than they could make through lending markets, and that tamped down the hot money on the streets. But now, right now, the Federal Reserve has a tremendous problem. It's got a balance sheet that's wildly out of whack, and they've been working for 2 years to try to fix this problem. It's not fixing very well, even as they're trying to get rid of the zero interest rate policies that have persisted ever since over the last 10 years. They're gradually trying to raise rates, but every time the Fed tries to raise rates, the political class screams bloody murder, because people like Donald Trump, and it's not just Trump, it's everybody in Washington, is convinced that the only way you can really have a sound economy is to have zero interest rates. So the Fed is highly politicized and super sensitive right now, and they're between a rock and a hard place, trying to get rid of the balance sheet while trying to normalize interest rate policies and be responsive to markets. So it's a broken system in every sense. People like Bernanke, who writes a book that he saved the economy in 2008, I'm telling you, everything is worse now than it was then. We think we learn from history, you and I learn from history, but folks in Washington don't learn from history at all. They keep making worse decisions. What they did after 2008 was as bad as what they did in 1932. And what it tells me is that, and here's a very interesting fact of what happened after 2008. People were watching the financial system collapse all around them, and boats unable to get bonded for trips to deliver goods, and the President of the United States warning people if they go to the cash machines, there may not be cash in the ATMs unless there's a $400 billion bailout, then there's QE1 and QE2 and QE3. All this stuff, people were watching the financial markets. What asset is going to be benefiting, in some sense, from the crisis? Where is the money going to flow? And this implausible, glorious phoenix rises from the ashes of disaster called cryptocurrency. It was a shock. Many of us were in early. Most everybody else in the establishment thought it was crazy and it would never work. But that lesson has not been forgotten. And you've heard this before, but I think if another crisis comes along, we're going to see crypto as the great alternative. No central point of failure, direct access, genuine economic democracy, security for your wealth, clean audit trails, all the things you look for in finance that the SEC and the Federal Reserve and all the regulatory agencies have completely failed to provide. This, I think, is somewhere in our future. I'm not prepared to say when it could happen, but that it can happen, there can be absolutely no dispute about it. So over the last several months, I've thrown myself very deeply into a study of a really interesting question. Is it possible that the US will actually default as a government on its debt and become credit unworthy, in which case we can just, we're going to be in for a wild ride? Is that actually possible? The fact is that it happened one time before. Does anybody know when that happened? Last American default on debt obligations? It was 1933. The least told aspect of the New Deal. I'm going to quickly review the history and tell you what happened. That's actually an amazing story, and hardly anybody even understands it. And it underscores why crypto is so important. So the Great Depression hit in 1929. Between 1929 and 1934, the GDP of the American economy collapsed about 60%. This was an unimaginable disaster. We've never lived through anything like this, unless you held Bitcoin in 2018. No, it was a macroeconomic calamity of unparalleled sort. Durable goods orders in those 5 years fell 83%. Half of every American that was employed between 1929 and 1934 lost his or her job, and bread lines were around the block in every city in the country. It was an incredible calamity. Hoover was the president. FDR got elected in 1932. In the months before the inauguration, which took place in March 4th in 1933, FDR refused to coordinate anything with Hoover. There was a bank panic going on. People were rushing to the banks because they no longer trusted the banks with their money. And the banking system was not liquid enough to actually to support these bank runs. So there was a real fear throughout the entire country. So several states started actually shutting down the banks. Now this is an amazing thing to have happened. Imagine you have your money in the bank, you try to get it out. I don't know, these days you go to your online app, you pull up Wells Fargo, it says, I'm sorry, right now, we're closed, you can't get your money. Right? Imagine something like that happening to you. That creates a real sense of panic. There was, FDR actually campaigned on a promise to keep the gold standard. He wanted sound money. He made several speeches about this. But he was a famous liar, and so one of the very first things he did when he took office on March 4th was bring his advisors in. These guys were basically complete idiots about monetary policy, knew nothing about it. Some were economists, but had never actually studied the topic. Guys like Raymond Moley and the fascist Rex Tugwell. They just began to dream. What do we want to do? And the idea was floated, hey, why don't we just get rid of this stupid gold problem, collect all the gold, get all the money, and set up a kind of corporativist fascist state. Sounds like a good idea? Why not? Who cares? One of those guys, some of the advisors just resigned at that point because they realized that this was, one of them, Lou Douglas, I think his name, said that this would represent the end of Western civilization as we know it, if we take this path. But that's exactly the path they took, and it was the priority. So almost immediately they shut all the banks, excluded everybody from getting anywhere near their deposits, and the shutdown of the banks lasted a full week. When the banks reopened, they were opened with a new law that was passed by executive order and amended by Congress. The banking bill that Congress passed, absolutely nobody read it. It flew through Congress, and it authorized the administration to collect all the gold in the country, which they eventually did through executive order. Signs were posted on telephone poles and banks all over the country. You have to turn in your gold if you own any. And if you don't, there's criminal penalties of $10,000, which is a lot of money in those days. Criminal penalties if you held on to gold. You had to take your gold to the bank and get it replaced with dollars. And many people, many so-called hoarders, hodlers of the day, were thrown into jail. And all the gold was collected. Gold exports were forbidden by the US government. And then the rest of the 100 days proceeded. You know the story with the alphabet super agencies that were created to regulate things, setting up a partnership between business and government, all the rest of it. By January of 1934, the devastating announcement had been made by FDR. The dollar was no longer worth 1/20th an ounce of gold. It was now worth 1/35th an ounce of gold, and the gold standard as we once knew it was no more. On that day, every single gold clause and every contract, public and private, was invalidated by the US government. Invalidated just overnight. Now, how did they get away with this? How do you do that? How do you have a government that just invalidates? What is this, some sort of banana republic? Is this what we're going to do? How did they get away with it? Well, it was challenged in court, and the Supreme Court heard a series of cases, famously called the Gold Clause cases, which nobody reads because nobody cares. The Supreme Court, by a majority of one, affirmed FDR's decision to invalidate all the gold contracts and confiscate everybody's gold and basically violate the Constitution to become tyrannical. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's fine. That was a precedent that happened, and it remains the precedent today. It's never been challenged. Basically, after those decisions, the federal government today has unlimited, I would say, totalitarian power over the dollar. That's the world we live in right now. They can do anything. Now, a very interesting question that occurred to me as I'm reading through this. Why is it that after this calamity of 1934, which was economically disastrous for the country, by the way, the worst thing you want to do in a financial crisis is destroy the money. But that's what they keep doing. Every single time there's a financial crisis, what should we do? Let's destroy the money even more. That's what they did in 2008. Precedent was established in 1933 and 1934. How is it, and why is it, that the federal government was ever able to borrow a nickel after that? And that's an interesting question. Because any other government in the world that tried to do such a thing, if it were a state government, it would have gone belly up. And in fact, this happened many times in American history. The answer has something to do with a public perception that the people who were running the system were extremely smart, very knowledgeable, had high degrees at academic institutions, made good radio addresses. FDR's fluid voice on the radio convinced the public to settle down, calm down. And two other factors: the US had tremendous military might, and very crucially, the Federal Reserve had a printing press that would forever cover liabilities that were racked up. And so somehow, this combination of factors led the US to become credit-worthy again. Now, the Great Depression didn't finally end until after World War II. It was an unbelievable climate, and we saw in the 1950s that the economy began to grow again, mostly because the velocity of money had dramatically shifted in the middle of the 1930s, which is to say that people stopped trusting the banks. They started holding their money in their mattresses. They were defying what FDR was telling them to do, and the capital began to grow and grow. Risk aversion basically took over the entire country for 15 years following the stock market crash of 2012, and that led to a buildup of a huge amount of capital, and eventually the economy recovered. Now, one of the reasons I've been so fascinated by this is I work for the American Institute for Economic Research in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. It's a fascinating institution with an amazing history. The guy who founded it was named Edward C. Harwood, and he was a professor at MIT at the time. He watched all this unfold. He was a monetary scientist, and he saw what was going on. He had been studying this. He came out with a book on business cycles in 1932, was it, Max? 1932? Yeah. And a brilliant book saying business cycles come about because of liquidations following inflations, credit expansions. So he kind of predicted everything that was going to happen in the future. And he saw what was going on in Washington, and he realized something. These people have no idea what they're doing. They're clueless, and they're potentially totalitarian, and you cannot have a free society so long as you have a central point of failure that's that egregious and that stupid. And he established the American Institute for Economic Research in 1933 as a think tank, as a research institution to counter this trend towards the nationalization of money and push people to take care of themselves and look after their own personal finances, protect their wealth from these people, and in a broader sense, establish a kind of scientific, theoretical, philosophical basis for what used to be called liberalism, or what we today just simply call freedom. And it was a beautiful thing to see. And he knew that we needed an institution that was independent of government and independent of academia, because the academics were corrupt back then, and government was corrupt back then. I suggest to you today, my friends, it's not any better now than it was then. In fact, it's far, far worse. The financials of this country are in terrible shape. You start looking at the unfunded liabilities of the federal government, I can give you all kinds of figures. None of them mean anything. Is it 12 trillion? Is it 50 trillion? Is it 210 trillion? Is it 400 trillion? It depends on how you calculate it. Whatever it is, this government cannot pay its debts. We are living on air with the most levered up macroeconomic structure in history, all depending on the wisdom of our masters in Washington. But here's the thing. We live in the 21st century. Something is different between now and then. In the old days, people took recourse to gold. That's all they had to protect themselves from these monsters. Thanks to Satoshi Nakamoto, we now have cryptocurrency that we can own. I'm very concerned about the rise of crypto banks, by the way. I think it's much better for you to own your own crypto. And this new technology is unfolding itself and showing itself in every institution. It's not just about Bitcoin or any of the alternatives to Bitcoin, all of which I'm a fan of. I love this whole sector. It's about an underlying technology that gives power over resources to individuals, that establishes immutable audit trails, clean lines of ownership, and a way of living in a post-state era. How close are we coming to that era? I would suggest to you that we're almost there. If not, maybe we're already in it. The shutdown we lived in for the last month is a sign. Think about it. A century ago, almost every serious person believed that if you wanted something to be truly reliable, truly efficient, truly wonderful and dependable, you should turn it over to government, right? You laugh. We laugh about that now. That's the difference between then and now. We're headed to a new era, my friends. Get ready for anarchy. It's coming. It's coming. Fortunately today, thank you, Satoshi, we have an alternative. You're at the right spot in the right place in history. Price is up, price is down, it doesn't matter. Everything has fundamentally changed. We finally have a modern system of ownership that puts you in charge and allows civilization to survive the monsters that are constantly destroying it. Thank you so much.